Hello everybody, and welcome to the Academy of Urbanism's Urbanism Lunch Hour, and our discussion today on shaping how healthy economies can be developed across all our towns and regions. I'm Pam Alexander, founder, academician and former director of the Academy, chair of Commonplace Digital Limited, and as you know, on a few other things as well. I'm absolutely delighted that we have with us today John Montgomery, Dr. John Montgomery, who's joining us from Brisbane, and the new, this month, chairman of the Connected Places Catapult, which is one of the boards I'm on. So I'm very delighted to welcome Greg Clark, Professor Greg Clark, I should say. Now, a few housekeeping points. If you don't want to be recorded, we are recording this, so please turn your video off. And we will also be recording the chat box. And I'd really ask you that we are as polite in this meeting as we would be in any, and we don't chat while the presentations are going on, but we will ask you to use the chat box for questions because we are going to have a good half an hour, I hope, at the end to engage you all in the discussion stimulated by John and Greg's presentation. You will all be on mute until then. But I may invite some of the questioners to put their questions themselves towards the end. So use the chat box for questions. We all know that healthy economies are absolutely critical to creating thriving communities and a good quality of life for the people in places. And I'm very, very pleased that we're today focusing on the economies that we will be needing to recover as we come out of COVID-19, as we look to a future with very different advantages and disadvantages for both sectors and places, and as we look at levelling up and bringing greater equality into our towns and cities and sub-regions and regions. And we're going to start, without any more ado, with John Montgomery. Dr. Montgomery is an urban planner, known to many of you, an urban and regional economist, and a strategic urban designer who's joining us from Brisbane. And he's published several books and articles on city regions, on economic development, on strategic master planning, and on place. And I believe there's a new one coming out soon, John, which I'm sure you'll tell us about. Over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Pam, and a very good day to you, ladies and gentlemen. It's the middle of the night here, but I'll say good day to you from Australia. Properly. About back in January, I didn't have anything to do, so I thought I'd write a wee article, and in the back of my mind I still had things about regional economies and levelling up. If you remember, just after the election, the Prime Minister said this was a priority, so I thought I'd maybe try and make a few little suggestions. And that's how this presentation that you're going to see got started. However, by the time we got to the end of February and the middle of March, it was obvious that we were in a sort of deeper set of problems and even a crisis that hadn't been there in January. At least we didn't know about it then. Nevertheless, it may still be the case that when we're rebooting our economy, which is what we have to do, we'll still have to look at the north of England as a particular case. So I'm just wondering how you would do both of those things. So, number one thing that I'd like to say, if I could have the next slide, please, Sonia. Right. I'm going to just quickly go through regional policy in the UK. I'm going to talk about aggregate demand and stimulus spending. What is a successful city region? What does supply side economic development mean? And how does this translate into economic geography and places? So that's what I'm going to try and do. Next one. Right. This goes back, believe it or not, we've been trying to do this regional policy thing for 90 years. 90 years, ladies and gentlemen. And around about the early 1930s, it was Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister, who took a particular interest in this. So you can see a list of things that we've been trying to do all that time. And I'm going to say to you that with some good exceptions, none of it has worked. Next one. Now, the reason, I'm probably overstating this, the reason none of it's worked particularly well is because we go about it the wrong way. We borrow lots of money and we fund very large-scale projects. And the expectation is that by spending that money, you will create a stimulus in the economy. The problem is that when you go for things that are too ambitious, they take ages to deliver, they cost too much, and there's delays in spending, delays in getting the thing finished, and the jobs only come in at the construction phase anyway. So I'm putting it to you that although you might have local infrastructure projects, big regional things like, sorry folks if this upsets anybody, but like the Humber Bridge in its day, or even HS2 now, is not, in my view anyway, the best way to go about this. So next slide, please. Here's a wee thing about how cities and city regions generate wealth. Some of you might have seen this before, but it's all about firm formation, exports, division of labour, innovation, clusters and networks of businesses that may enter trade, or they may just co-locate, and that, right, good. And then what causes growth? We get to the point about technological revolutions, which is why I'm so pleased Greg's here. That's one of the reasons I'm so pleased. Now, this gives rise to new industries, new markets, new demands. Next one. Now, there's a few people now written books about this, about how you tell a successful regional economy. These were a couple of Swedish guys, and they argued that you would have knowledge, databases, key competencies, and that you could create and innovate. And I love this bit here about the subliminal abilities, I wish I had some, to produce new work in art, technology and science. Next one. Here's another couple. This is a guy called Truth from America, and also Yusuf and Wei Ping Wu. And they're just making the same points, really. Something Pam said, the economic quality of life depends on net wealth creation, more secure employment, low startup and expansion costs, available buildings, a sympathetic attitude to things like compliance, regulation and tax. We'll come back to that. Next one, please. Right, this is by way of a wee story. Supply side economics, which I was taught by a man called Robin Murray. He used to say, go in and look at the sectors. You have to understand what industries you have in the place, how they trade, who the markets are, how employment works within those industries, what kind of investments are we making. And so that's what I've always tried to do since then. And if the trick in this is to encourage investment, which it is, then you have to maybe take things out the way that stop people investing. So you want to encourage development, job creation, growth and prosperity. Now then, after the war, sorry, the Second World War, Germany was on its uppers, and the whole place was pretty well flattened. And a man called Ludwig Erhard appeared. He'd been an academic, and some of his colleagues in Freiburg, and they were asked to resuscitate the West German, it was West Germany by this time, West German economy. So I think of the Wirtschaftswunder grew from that point. And what he did is he got rid of all the regulations. He took away price controls, wage controls. They brought in a new currency to stabilise things, so that you could, if you invested in West Germany, you knew it wasn't going to get taken away by galloping inflation. And they cut taxes. They cut taxes and they made overtime tax-free. They got 20 years of fantastic growth out of this. Within the first few years, it was hitting 18% and higher. So this got me thinking this is back in January again, could the North be West Germany? You're supposed to laugh. Right, next one. So, assuming you were going to follow this sort of approach where you're cutting taxes, you're making it easier for people to employ people, you're removing barriers to growth. And in this way, you're chasing added value, added work, and you're bringing in innovation because people will try things. This is the point at which the whole country should, in my view, be looking at the first stages of opening up the economy and then beyond that. So we should be supporting the businesses that have already been hit so that they can get back on their feet, take their staff back on and get trading again, and hopefully not too many of them will get lost. So I would say that the first step is to get that working, and especially in industries like tourism, your nighttime economy stuff, hospitality, retailing, help them to keep going. Then you can worry about other things after that, or maybe you're laying plans for that at the same time. And it'll involve a bit of geography when we look at the north, but it could be the same sort of arguments apply in other parts of the country. So
2 minutes, please, John.
2 minutes, good. Right, collection of city regions, core cities, local economy partnerships, enterprise zones, free ports. That thing in the middle of the screen there, that is a free port. So I'm thinking you urban designers and planners and stuff could get stuck into producing a few of those. Opportunity zones, which is a similar thing where you make it attractive for people to invest. And then I'm still anxious about freestanding towns because they seem to be left out a lot in the last 10 or 20 years. The ones that have lost their economies, and there's not much left. And finally, we want to finally? Right. So what I've argued is by approaching the supply side, you're looking at all the new industries, sources of new work. You're looking at regions, cities, towns, peri-urban areas. It'll be the whole lot because business will go where it can and where it wants to go. You can't centrally plan this, you've got to kind of work with it. And then we'll have all these other things which Craig knows a lot more about than me. I'm just trying to make the point. And Dave Rudlin has just produced a really good book called Climax City. And it made me remember Chris Thaler and the central place theory and the fact that all these little nodes you can see are towns and villages and small cities and a larger city. And they work according to the markets that exist surrounding them. Well, it's more complicated than that now, but this is still a nice way to look at it. You have these connected places and you get variation in the built form. So we don't just have high density and then or decentralisation. It's not a binary choice. You have to have both. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I think that will do us for now. so much.
Thank you very much, John. I can't tell you how exciting it is to see hexagons again. My whole geography 3 years at university was about hexagons in the 1970s. And I was learning about the new science of proxemics and the influence.
I don't believe that. You're younger than me.
I'm interested by that last slide. Thank you very much. And a good introduction to the context for regional economics and the influence of it on place, which I know Greg will be taking further forward for us. So we'll have questions at the end rather than in the middle. So I'll now introduce Professor Greg Clark, who is the new chairman of the Connected Places Catapult, as I've said. He's a well-known global advisor and author on cities and urban economics and on leadership and investment, as he is now a global head of the Future Cities and New Industries section of HSBC Bank. He's a thought leader on the evolution of the metropolitan century and supports leaders in more than 100 cities worldwide. So I imagine may bring us some very interesting international context for our discussion, as well as being the author of a number of books and many, many articles. Over to you, Greg.
Well, Pam, thank you very much indeed. And let me wish everybody a good lunchtime. If you're enjoying your lunch, please carry on. I'm very grateful to you, Pam, for making the intro, and also to the Academy of Urbanism for hosting this. I spend, as Pam's just said, much of my life at HSBC Bank, 63 countries, 300 cities, 20 million business clients. And much of what I have to do with them is kind of pull together 3 things that have become 4 things. So one thing is the century of cities, the 1980 to 2080 leap from 40% to 80%, or from 3 billion to nearly 8 billion people living in cities. Then we combine that, of course, with the 4th industrial revolution, the 22 maturing technologies, the 5 great new technological platforms. That then gets combined with the climate emergency, the challenge of climate change, the future of the planet. And of course, increasingly, there's a 4th dimension to this conversation, which is the global pandemic, the current one, and those that may come in the future. So if you like, I think we're all suffering from the Chinese curse of living in an interesting time in which these 4 cylinders of activity, these 4 drivers of growth, somehow come together in different business models for companies, but they also come together in different urban and regional economies. And of course, they come together as common challenges for groups of citizens and also, of course, for governments. So I'm going to try to make sense of a little bit of this as we go ahead. And of course, I'm absolutely honored and delighted to be now chairing the Connected Places Catapult. This gives me personally an opportunity to reconnect with the UK, which is very important to me. So I want to start really by saying something about COVID-19. It seems to me that it makes sense to think of COVID-19 in sort of 3 ways. Firstly, it's obviously a global health crisis. Secondly, it's clearly the trigger of a major economic shock. And thirdly, it seems to me it's potentially a change agent. And the question is, what kind of change agent will it be? What's the changed normal, or the new normal, or the new abnormal, or whatever language you want to use, that it's going to foster? How do we know what that will be? And what will that mean for cities, for regions, for placemaking, for urbanism, and everything else? And of course, these are not questions to which there's a right answer, but they are questions it's very interesting to think about and explore. And what I want to suggest very briefly is that I think we should look at COVID-19 as, in a sense, revealing a series of imperatives that have become more compelling, more urgent, perhaps more challenging, and maybe even more importantly, more domains in which leadership needs to be exercised. So let's start with the issue of trade. It's palpably clear, is it not, that what COVID-19 has revealed here is that the prioritization of efficiency over resilience in global supply chains has led to a system of supply and global trade which is not fit for purpose in the moment of a crisis or a shock that disrupts our normal corridors of flow. And what's emerged from that, of course, is a new agenda around sovereign capability, You might call this the reshoring, the onshoring, the nearshoring agenda. You might wish to call it the just in case rather than the just in time agenda. But there's a movement here to think about how to reform global flows of capital and goods, using, of course, the second big thing that I think has been revealed, and I would call it perhaps that we've had a leapfrog moment, is that new technologies, particularly digital technologies, have come to our aid in this desire to prevent further contagion. And as a consequence, there's been a massive uptick, not just in video conferencing and flexible working, but also in distance learning, in online entertainment, in other service retail, in telemedicine, and many other forms of digital usage that have, in a sense, made us jump through to a new cycle in technology uses. Many of you have seen, as I have seen, the wonderful cartoon that said, what was it that induced the digital transformation in your business? Was it your CEO? No. Was it your chief technology officer? No. Was it COVID-19? Yes, it was. Okay. The third thing I think it's revealed is a challenge in our health systems. Both the question about the inadequacy of healthcare systems and the relative unreadiness of different systems around the world, a winners and losers environment in which Taiwan comes top and various other countries we won't name now come bottom. But it's also revealed a whole set of health inequalities here that you can now see manifesting themselves in terms of new social movements. Now, one of the consequences, it seems to me, of this is that we've become acutely aware that not just different socioeconomic groups, but different kinds of environmental factors have begun to impact upon human health, whether it's crowded housing conditions, whether it's particular situations with regard to clean air quality and the link between air quality and respiratory diseases, or whether it's something to do with the forms of work that people do and the obligations they face to interact with people on a daily basis. In other words, health inequalities have led us to really understand much better labor market inequalities and environmental inequalities. This, I think, leads to a new, rather urgent agenda around not just health and medicine, but also around healthy living. And it has big implications for the insurance sector, for example. But there's a very close connection between this issue of human health and the next issue of planetary health, if you like. You see, the connection of air quality and respiratory health, or the connection of food quality and the health of the animal kingdom and its biodiversity, put together with the experience of lockdown, which has been a kind of accidental experiment in low touch, low travel, low consumption, low carbon living, creates, I think, together an imperative to understand much more how the push for zero carbon is going to be much more compelling after this crisis, but how climate change is also affecting human health and therefore becoming critical. The fifth big issue, I think, is to do with politics. There's a geopolitics here that's to do with multilateralism. There's also a whole series of issues about the relationships between citizens and government, changed notions of what data sharing is and should be, concerns about cyber security being connected to ideas about health security. How do we get the balance right between those two things? But an expectation, I think, by citizens that governments will play a more active role in their lives, or that citizens will have to campaign very hard to stop governments from doing that. Both, I think, scenarios apply. And then sixthly, I think there's something that we might describe as the possibility of a new social contract. If you like, the increased neighborliness, the social capital, the philanthropy, the mutual aid that's been experienced through the crisis so far, coupled with an intolerance of inequality that we see in evidence on our streets all of the time, coupled with, I think, a desire to make sure that the recovery from this crisis is one that is just and fair. All of this leads to a set of imperatives that I think are going to have very big implications for space, for place and mobility, which is what I want to talk about in just a few minutes, and I'll be quick now. So the point I'm really making is that COVID-19 is a game changer because it makes certain kinds of shapers or drivers of change more prevalent, more obvious to us, and much more difficult to ignore. Now, from the point of view of how this relates to regional economies, I want to make three very quick points. And in a way, I'm trying to stimulate a conversation here. I think that what I've said to you about the reshoring and sovereign capability conversation has massive implications for the content of urban and regional economies, providing opportunities, I think, in the North and the West, if we can use this global language, for the diversification of economies, the reshoring of various kinds of manufacturing, and if you like, the tightening geographically of all sorts of production activities so that we can rediversify our economies and perhaps, for example, in the UK, shift away from a model which is so dominantly oriented towards services and therefore the locations that are good at services. On the other hand, I would say digitization changes the shape and size of regions in such a way that the notion that a region is somehow bounded by the idea of a daily commute no longer really makes any sense. There's a new set of choices now available to people as to where they live, when they work, how they travel, and what the relationship is between workplace and home place in a new way, such that it's perfectly possible, as is already the case in many parts of the world, especially in the USA these days, it's possible to have a job that is somehow based in one location and have a home that's based in another. And you can imagine what this does for our old geography of labor markets and housing markets. It effectively begins to integrate old notions of region into new notions of digitized region, and has all sorts of consequences for how spatial economies might emerge. The third big point, of course, is the green recovery, the building back better story. How do we embrace climate change as part of our recovery program? And what sort of industries would this mean in our built environment and our mobility systems? Where do we house our hydrogen factories? Where do we do our off-site construction of homes? Where do we create the vehicles of the future and the buildings of the future? It seems to me that this provides all sorts of opportunities for a different kind of spread of activity around the country. I'll be very quick now, Pam, don't worry. From the point of view of the Connected Places Catapult, this provides us with many opportunities to dock those rapidly maturing technologies that I spoke about at the beginning with 6 kind of clear domains of where the recovery from COVID-19 is going to need to be sharp and focused. But it also allows us, I think, to observe, if urbanism is our theme, that the shapes and sizes of our urban world, our urban century, are changing. It's not that urbanism is being reversed by COVID-19. It's rather that there's an acceleration towards the new shapes and sizes and models that we can accommodate with it. And this is the last slide, Pam. I would prefer, rather than this conversation that's happening about people leaving the physical city to join the virtual city, for all the merits that the virtual city has, and for all the merits that we know the physical city has, I think we have to start using our imagination to think about what the blended city will look like. What will it be like to be able to use the assets, amenities, the design, the place qualities of the physical city, and couple that with the convenience, the efficiency, the customization possibility, the on-demand and as-a-service models of the virtual city, and build, as it were, a new notion of a city region that comes out of this, where multiple cities are, in a sense, within the blended city, where the choices that citizens have are where to live, where to work, how to travel, when and how to consume, and how to start developing, in a sense, both a policy framework and an investment prospectus for this kind of blended city that I think will end up being the ultimate consequence of the COVID-19 interruption. Pam, I'll stop there, and hopefully that will provoke some discussion.
Hello, Pam. Can you unmute your microphone? Okay.
Sorry, rookie error there. Thank you both very much indeed, and welcome to those who joined us through those discussions. Please do ask your questions now on the chat box. We've got a good half an hour, and I hope we can stimulate a really good discussion from that. I'm going to start off by saying what a relief it is not to see hexagons anymore, Greg. Your blended city, I think, has proximities which are not necessarily defined by hexagons. But I wonder whether both of you would like to comment on what you see as the potential left behind places in this new normal. I was struck at a Deloitte webinar yesterday by some examples where unemployment at the moment is highest in Blackpool, maybe not surprising, but also Luton and Slough in the top percentages of furloughed places, as well as Sunderland and Burnley. We have Crawley in the topmost number of furloughed employees. Clearly, with both those examples, it's to do with the impact of the airports and the complete close down. But once furloughing finishes, there are going to be some real challenges. Where do you see the biggest dangers are likely to be, particularly in the UK? Greg, would you like to start?
Well, the first thing I'll say is, as I work at HSBC Bank, I have to still love hexagons because that's our kind of our corporate livery.
Obviously founded by geographers.
Yeah. So obviously this is the big challenging question, isn't it? Because anybody will want to test theories or concepts of how we come out of COVID-19 by applying it to the places that have the most wicked and challenging positions. So my feeling is overall that the new agility that has emerged from COVID-19 and will, I think, emerge as part of this recovery provides opportunities for all sorts of what we might call mediocre places. And I'm using every bit of language here has got inverted commas around it, in the sense that it provides places with an opportunity to come up with a fresh equation around affordability, livability, connectivity, public services, and ultimately in the future, the ability to host and house a new configuration of jobs in the way that John was describing. But I wouldn't pretend for a minute that the places that have the biggest challenges, especially the places that have the populations that have the highest dependency ratios, are going to automatically become winners from this process. I do think it provides them with an opportunity to reconfigure, to reposition, to try to attract new kinds of investment, to make an appeal to certain kinds of more mobile populations, and to think about the talent that they can attract, the lifestyle proposition they can offer. But as we know, I think from all of the UK's history of deindustrialization, the challenge in the end is not to remake the place. The challenge is somehow to remake the people. And so, you know, my remarks about this would be sober, because I think that one of the challenges resulting from, you know, several decades of neglect in social investment in the UK, and perhaps where the UK stands out most in comparison to some of the other OECD countries, is the poor level of social investment. Simply speaking, our population has been less adaptable and less agile as we've gone through different cycles of economic activity. So I think that's where the challenge lies, Pam. It's a social investment challenge, and that I think is key to whether it's Blackpool or Luton, or it's Hull or Stoke or Grimsby or anywhere else.
Well, I'll bring Kevin Murray in to ask a question about that after we've heard John's thoughts on the subject.
Thanks, Pam.
John
first.
John first, yes.
John first, okay. Well, I was just going to say that left behind places, yes. There's places that have been left high and dry. I promised the other day not to mention this, but near where I'm from, there's a thing called Bathgate, which was the subject of a famous song, Letter from America. And looking back on the deindustrialization, Bathgate used to have a car industry, it had electronics, it had electrical engineering, had all sorts of stuff. There's nothing there now. You go there and the biggest employer is McDonald's, followed by the doctor's surgery. So whilst I'm happy to see better investment in social capital, social, well, what would I call it though? And the sociability of towns, perhaps, is what I mean to say. I'm happy to see that, but if you don't have an economy in a place like Bathgate, there's not that, and I hope nobody's listening in from Bathgate, but you're not going to have an awful lot left, I'm afraid. And switch it to another town, which I know in the same neck of the woods, called Carluke. You've probably never heard of Carluke, have you? But it has two exporting industries. One is jam making, and they take the fruit from the Clyde Valley. And the other one is this brilliant butcher who does all sorts of Scottish delicacies, like black pudding and haggis and stuff, and sells it all around the world. And so Carluke's got a better chance than Bathgate because it's got industries that are already there doing well and exporting. So at the level of the towns, and I worry about towns that have been kind of left high and dry and isolated and all the rest of it. At the level of those towns, I would suggest that you have to go and find out what the economy is and in part shape it around the things that are already there. The other bit would then be to the future, and as Craig was saying, new industries, but you can't just, oh, sorry, I'm getting Scottish, you can't just wave a magic wand, there's a lot of investment and work goes in.
Well, can I ask a few more people to join the discussion?
Sorry.
Because I think one of the very interesting questions is who to invest and how to invest. And if the people are key, and we've always known that skills and capacities are absolutely key to economic growth, the question is which institutions might help us. Kevin, come in on that particular question.
My question is to both. Universities have changed in a lot in the last 10, 15 years. So my question is really, what role could they play, given there are more of them and they are in different regional contexts, both in terms of research and particularly innovation? A lot of them are very specialist in advanced manufacturing and engineering and so on, but also in this wider social agility that Greg talked about, in terms of developing the capacity of the population. So the role they play in the local economy and local health, but also in design and physical transformation of the place. A lot of the time our old universities were academic, detached, separate from towns and cities, and certainly from their regions. But could they be playing a much more inclusive and stronger role in that transformation that both speakers have been talking about?
And as you answer, could I extend it slightly to include our further education institutions and the opportunities of apprenticeships and links between universities and industry? John, do you want to start?
Sorry, was that me?
Yes.
Oh, right. Well, the answer is yes. Yes to all of that, Kevin. I think universities have opened up a lot more, and there are places in the country you go to where they're playing a really big role in the economy and in setting up new businesses. I was in a place called Wollongong, which is south of Sydney, just recently. And the university there has been spending the last 10 years trying to get tech jobs going and commercialising new discoveries. This is not my strongest suit, but apps and programs and all of that stuff. And they're actually now getting people from Sydney moving down because it's a nicer place to live. And you can still pop back to Sydney, and you might even work in Sydney one day a week. So it does open the whole thing up, as Craig was saying. But the universities are going to, I don't want to use the word anchor, but it came into my head, they're playing a big role in local economies, but not all towns have got them.
Thanks. Greg?
Nice to see you, Kevin. And I think the challenge here is really one of helping the university system to reform itself. Look, the problem, I think, is that the university system has become so dependent on international students for its financial model that COVID-19 presents a kind of existential crisis to the universities, which is going to take them a while to work through, Kevin. And I suspect that as a consequence of that, they're not going to be thinking in quite the pluralistic ways we would want them to. That would be the first point. The second point would be clearly the big differentiator between our universities around the country has been the degree to which they've been willing to engage with local and regional economies. And as your question points out, that's been variable. Why is it variable? Because they're not incentivized to do it. They operate within a regulatory framework that incentivizes other things, particularly research and teaching, and a financial model that really emphasizes teaching. So there's a challenge there. I guess the other thing I would say, though, is, you know, one of the legacies of Britain's imperial past is that we do unusually, by international comparisons, have a very large number of very high quality universities that are actually very well distributed around the country by international standards. And therefore, if the failure to use our universities to develop our new industry base, to spawn our next generation of entrepreneurs, to do the translational research would be, you know, such a ridiculous missed opportunity that we can't afford for it to happen. So I hope that the new universities minister will sort of take cognizance of that. I think Pam's question is actually an even more pernicious one. It seems to me that the problem in the further education system in the UK is not that we don't have superb lecturers working in great institutions, many of which are very well led. The problem is that they're locked within a system of vocational education that lacks imagination and lacks agility and hasn't been particularly good at engaging with industrial development processes. And when you look at all of the evidence about why the UK has this productivity gap, a lot of it is to do with the style of leadership of our businesses and the failure, as it were, to achieve real business co-investment in the kind of adaptation and agility skills of the labor force. So the problem is a cultural one in our business community, and that's reinforced, I think, by institutional rigidities in the way further education colleges work. So Pam, I share the ambition very much, but I think we've got quite a bit of change to do before we can really make the most of those institutions.
I'm going to inject a comment there, because one of the things when I was working at CEDA, which we found to be really effective, was to link universities and new further education colleges as an escalator with the ability to bring a link between new businesses that we were introducing into places like Hastings and Folkestone. The University of Brighton created University Centre Hastings. The University of the Creative Arts created Folkestone. And that actually enabled people in places where, frankly, the only opportunity was McDonald's to think about getting new skills, and an ability across the board for the institutions to try and bring the new businesses that would use those skills. So I'm going to link a few questions now from a number of people about the role of the public sector in shaping healthy economies for the future, both in terms of the infrastructure that's needed, and perhaps also what you mean by sovereign capability, Greg. Just where do you see the public sector leading the partnerships that will help us in this new normal?
Well, I think the public sector has to set the agenda in a certain way here. You know, I'm thinking in quite long time cycles here of sort of 1830 to 1890, 1890 through to about 1960, and then 1960 through to about 2010. And in those three time cycles, the public sector in the UK, I think, largely failed to do the critical thing it needed to do. In the first of those cycles, it failed to help diversified economies to grow, and as a consequence, they were very specialized and vulnerable. In the second part of that cycle, it really encouraged, you know, highly specialized trade routes, but it didn't think about the consequences of disruption on those. And in the third part of that cycle, it hasn't really played a role in building an economy that's more about a shared prosperity system. So I do think that it's going to be some kind of combination of a souped up new industrial strategy, with very progressive devolution of budgets and strategic decision-making powers to devolved subnational entities of various kinds. It's going to be that coupled with John's proposition around a supply side stimulus plan. And it's going to have to provide incentives to businesses to want to be in partner with that. Some of that vision is quite well articulated in various government documents at various times by British governments of different political hues. What we don't seem to be so good at is mobilizing resources and energy around the implementation of these grand visions. So I suspect that what the public sector is going to need to do here is to think about how to mobilize much more, as it were, to take the new agility that COVID-19 has presented to us and use it not just to create field hospitals in 8 days, or to switch manufacturers towards ventilators, or to ignite the search for a vaccine, or to turn mobile phones into health screening devices, but use similar kinds of agility to really think in a different way about the economy. So new leadership with new thought and ability to mobilize differently, I think, is key.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Stuart Turner in here because I think his question is very relevant to the future there. Stuart, can you unmute yourself?
I've two points, Pam. Firstly, just to pick up on Kevin and the university question, was clearly the answer is yes. I think there is an awareness, and I think there's an awareness of their leadership role. And I would cite the example of the Oxford-Cambridge Arc, where already 10, under the initiative of the government, 10 universities have come together to form a universities group. They are active. They've actually taken a very broad agenda in terms of looking right across the board in terms of connectivity, placemaking, productivity, and environment. What I think is probably a more pertinent question or immediate question that's coming out of this, there is the belief and understanding, is actually how they work together. So it's more of a governance question, and also how they actually work with the local governance boards. And that is the biggest question mark, because politically it's a very fragmented process. I think I need to stop on that, but governance is a big key one. But coming to the other question, and that was about the economic agglomeration, we have, I think, traditionally always believed or been told, centre of cities, that we need to bring businesses together, physically together, into the city centres so that they can actually interact. And that's important from that economic point of view. I've always, certainly recently, wondered how important that is, whether that is actually slackening, and whether there is the evidence base around that to see how that might change given the kind of patterns that are now coming through in terms of the distribution. So it's that question, how important is that still?
And I think your blended city, Greg, to a certain extent answers that question, doesn't it? But would you like to give us some thoughts, and then John, on the partnerships with government and the forms that we're going to need government to take in the future?
Maybe John would like to start.
John?
Well, actually, I was interested in Stuart's point about agglomeration, because we have assumed that since the time of Alfred Marshall and later, and even Jane Jacobs talked about this as well. I'm beginning to think that it's not always necessary, and in fact, we did some research here in South East Queensland about 7 or 8 years ago, and we found that the businesses that were in the same area, they weren't intertrading at all. They just happened to be there. So there's, if you're going to have like a creative cluster, which is one of the things I used to get excited about, and I think that still works, because it's closer to being part of a place, and they get like Dublin, Temple Bar, all of these places, they get something back from the place as well. I'm not sure that and some of the other activities now to do with, to do with science and technology, if that's quite the same, and if they need to be in agglomerations at all. Sydney's talking about a technology precinct at the minute, and well, I hope that works, and I hope it goes well. But there's a chance that they won't intertrade at all. They'll be dealing with folk in San Francisco Bay Area and stuff like that. So, Stuart, it's not a very good answer, but I think it's both. We're going to have places that have agglomeration, and we would need to understand what they're about and how they work. And there's going to be other people that want to be distributed, and it might even be they move out, they move it to the edge of the city because they can get the amount of space they want there, and it's easier for employees to get in there, except for the ones that cycle.
Thanks, John. I'm hoping we might get in one more question, but I do want to give Greg the chance to answer that one as well.
I'm going to be very quick then, Pam, and say that I think that the leadership and governance issue that Stuart mentions is critical. It's unfashionable to talk about collaborative leadership, but actually if you go back to all of Porter's theories, it's collaborative leadership that helps you to foster a growth economy. So whether it's universities or businesses or local governments or others, collaborative leadership is key. It's also absolutely critical to optimizing the productivity of place. So when we talk about place-based productivity, the key variable is place-based collaborative leadership. We'll come back to that, no doubt. I think that the question about agglomeration varies now decisively sector by sector and by degree of digitization that's occurring. So it's quite clear that certain sectors still need the agglomeration advantages of high levels of interaction, whether it's because of trust or creativity or regulatory dimensions. City centres have a future. It's also very clear that there's a wide range of growth sectors that don't need those agglomeration advantages in the way John described. And it's also clear that it's possible to combine agglomeration with high levels of digitization, which means that you can participate in agglomeration in a virtual, partial or semi-detached way if you need to. This is good news for the UK that has a dependence on sectors where there are high levels of agglomeration advantages, because it means you can spread the geographical benefit of it.
Good.
Thank you. Well, one question from Lucas Lee, which takes us from the very broad down to the neighbourhood level. Tactical urbanism has been unbelievably helpful during this crisis, in providing more space for people to move around, in providing biking, in providing alternatives to what we usually feel we need to do and travel with in the city. How do you feel that this overrules traditional planning processes and is something we need to take on to the future? I have a feeling this is going to be very much the subject of next week's Urban Lunch Hour, but just to touch on that local level briefly, if you would, Greg and John.
John, shall I have a quick, I mean, all I would say is, if you remember my 7 key points arising from COVID-19, one of them is about a new social contract. The other is about the changing relationship between citizens and government. Another one is about digitization. Another one is about tackling these revealed inequalities. So I think that tactical urbanism, actually, I'm going to stop calling it tactical soon, because I think it's just citizen-led urbanism. But I think that tactical urbanism, agility of space, the ability of communities of interest to come together to make space more agile in pursuit of social need and community need, is going to be not just a critical thing that improves quality of life locally, but ultimately it's the combination of those things and how they happen in different cities that's going to lead to a strong dimension of a city's pulling power when it comes to talent, when it comes to innovative and creative businesses. If you like, tactical urbanism is a visible manifestation of how agile and creative a city is able to be.
Thank you. John, last word.
Well, it requires a bit of deregulation, so I can get back to my lifting regulations and taxes. But you'll all know what's going on in Soho at the minute. So that was a very difficult thing even to propose 25 years ago. At one point I was public enemy #1 in the planning profession, because I talked about the nighttime economy and letting things happen and getting local authorities to move out the way. I love all this tactical urbanism and taking spaces over and designing them, making them temporary, parklets, the whole lot. I think it's brilliant. But the government needs to be a bit more fleet-footed when it comes to these sorts of things. And because of COVID, going back to Greg's point, there's a chance that we can do all this, and we're not frightened to take controls away anymore. And I think that's one of the lessons I would take from tactical urbanism, is you don't need to control everything to death. You can let stuff live.
Thank you. I think that's a great moment on which to conclude today's discussion, which I'm really grateful to the speakers. I think jazz hands is the appropriate way of applause nowadays. So thank you very much. And I think Olga or Sonia, you have some slides for me to just conclude with a look forward to next week's lunch hour. All of these have been fascinating discussions. Next week's is about instant transformation, all of that tactical urbanism that we've been doing at various different scales. How can it lead to long-term change, and some of the advantages coming out of this period, which both our speakers have alluded to. And we have Henrietta Bamberg from Gale in Copenhagen, and Phil Jones, the chairman of PGA, and that will be chaired by Andreas Markaides, one of our directors and the managing director of Markaides Associates. So please join us next Friday, the 3rd of July. I cannot believe it. Where has June gone? For another in this great series. I'd like to thank everybody. Also, sorry, we seem to have whipped past the Scottish coffee mornings, which I'm assured are a great success. So Tuesday at 11, don't forget that, those of you accessing AOU Scotland. Thank you again to our speakers. Thank you to all of you. It's been great to see some old friends around the screen. And I hope that you've enjoyed a very stimulating discussion. Have a very good end of day and a great weekend. Thank you very much.